I had worked Cedar Hollow for Wyatt Crane the better part of 11 years, and in all that time I never once heard him speak his dead wife's name. Until the morning he told me he meant to marry a stranger off the Tuesday stage. We were forking hay to the saddle stock, the wind coming down off the Sabine Hills with the first real teeth of the season in it, and he said it the way he said everything, flat, with his eyes on the work and not on me. "Amos, I'm going into Harker's Bend Tuesday to be married. I'd be obliged if you'd have the wagon greased and the spare room aired." I set my fork down. A man does, when a thing like that lands on him out of a clear, cold sky. 11 years I'd known him to want nothing but the ranch and his solitude, and the grave up on the rise where Sarah Crane and the baby she died bringing into the world lay under the same flat stone. He'd built a wall around himself out of that grief, brick by brick, and I'd watched him live behind it so long I'd stopped believing there was a door. "Married," I said. "To who?" "To a widow named Hartley." He pitched the hay, even and steady. "She answered the notice I put up at the land office and the church. She's got a brother, a boy of 12. They've nowhere to winter. I've got a roof and a boy of my own to raise that needs a woman's hand more than he needs me, and I can't keep this place in mind, Tom, both once the snow shuts us in." He said it all in that gravel voice like he was reading a feed bill. "It's a bargain, Amos. Nothing more. She knows it for one. So do I." I'd been there the spring his brother Cole died of the lung fever down in the flats and left the boy, Tom, 4 years old and motherless already, on Wyatt's doorstep. I'd watched Wyatt take that child in the way he took in everything that needed taking in, silently, completely, asking nothing. And I'd watched him try for 3 years to be both the hard hand and the soft one, and fail at the soft one, because the soft one had died with Sarah. The boy was 7 now and quiet as a held breath, and he wanted something Wyatt didn't have left in him to give. So I didn't argue. I greased the wagon. Tuesday came in gray, with the smell of snow on it. Wyatt put on the one good coat he owned, the black wool he'd been married in the first time, though I doubt he thought of that, and he drove the 10 miles into Harker's Bend with Tom wedged on the seat between us and the boy not saying a word the whole way. I'd asked to come along. I told myself it was to mind the team. The truth is I wanted to see the woman who'd answer a notice from a stranger and tie herself to a man's whole hard life for a roof. The Tuesday stage was late, the way it always was once the high passes started to close. We waited in the cold by the depot, Wyatt standing apart with his hat low, and when the coach finally came rocking down the Harker Road with its lamps lit against the early dark, I watched him not move a muscle, not even when the door opened. She climbed down on her own. No man handed her and she didn't wait for one. She was younger than I'd figured, not a worn-out thing but a woman maybe 7 and 20, with a face that had taken some hard weather and kept its straightness through it, and she had one carpetbag in her hand and a boy at her back, lanky and half frozen, gripping a wooden crate to his chest like it was the last of everything he owned. Which, I'd learn, it near enough was. She found Wyatt out of the 3 or 4 of us standing there without anybody telling her which one. I never knew how. Maybe a woman in her place learns to read a man fast. She walked straight up to him, set down her bag and looked him level in the eye. "You're Crane," she said. "I am." "Della Hartley, this is my brother Eli." The boy ducked his head. She didn't soften her voice for the introductions. She stated them the way you'd state your terms. "Before we go any further, Mr. Crane, I'll say what I wrote in the letter, so there's no mistaking it once we're stood in front of a preacher. I'm not coming to you as a beggar. I'll keep your house and raise your boy as my own and not stint either, and I'll work as hard as any hand you've got. But I keep my brother under the same roof, fed and schooled the same as your Tom, and I'll not be spoken down to, nor will he. That's my half of it. If that's more than you bargained, say so now and I'll get back on the stage." There was a long silence then, with the wind worrying the depot lamps and the snow just starting to come down in slow, fat flakes between us. I held my breath. I'd known Wyatt Crane 11 years, and I'd never once heard anybody lay terms on him like he was an equal across a table. He looked at her a good while. Then he looked down at the boy Eli, half frozen and proud, hugging his crate. "What's in the crate, son?" Eli's chin came up. "Books," he said like he expected to be laughed at for it. "Our pa's, he was a schoolmaster before." Wyatt nodded slow, like that settled something in him. He picked up Della's carpetbag himself. "You'll not be spoken down to," he said. "Nor him. The boy can have the run of the books, and there's a school in the Bend 3 days a week he can ride to when the weather holds." He turned toward the wagon. "The preacher's expecting us. It's cold. Let's not keep him." And that was the whole of the courtship of Wyatt Crane and Della Hartley. No flowers, no pretty words, a bargain struck in the snow outside a depot. I helped the boy load his crate of books into the wagon bed, and his hands were so cold he could barely keep his grip, and I gave him my gloves and told him to hush about it when he tried to give them back. They were married 20 minutes later in the front room of Reverend Tolliver's house, with the Reverend's wife and me for witnesses and the 2 boys standing stiff by the door. Della Hartley said the words plain and clear. Wyatt said his low. When Tolliver said the part about "for as long as you both shall live," I saw something cross Wyatt's face, quick, like a cloud shadow over a field, and I knew he was hearing those same words spoken over Sarah in a warmer season a long way back. But he held. He put a thin band on Della's finger. I never asked where he got it, and I've always feared it was the first one, and I've always hoped it wasn't, and it was done. We drove home in the dark with the snow coming hard now, all 5 of us in the wagon, and not a soul said a word the whole 10 miles. But somewhere along the Quillen Road I felt the boy Eli, wedged in the bed behind me, stop shivering, and I looked back and saw his sister had pulled him in under her own shawl and wrapped the both of them in it against the wind. And Tom, Wyatt's Tom, who didn't take to anybody, had inched over in the straw until his small shoulder was near touching the stranger boy's, the 2 of them just sharing the warmth the way young things do. I faced front again and didn't say anything. But I thought, well, maybe. Cedar Hollow sat in a wide bend of the Quillen with the Sabine Hills standing close around it on 3 sides, so that come hard winter the snow filled the passes and shut the whole valley off from the world for weeks at a stretch. It was a good ranch, the best water in that part of the territory and grass that came up rich in the spring, but it was a lonesome place in the cold months, and a hard one, and many a hand had drawn his wages in October and not come back till the thaw. We were down to 4 men that winter, counting me and Wyatt, and the rest of the work fell where it always fell, which was on whoever was nearest when it needed doing. Della Hartley fell to it inside of a day. I'll not pretend the first weeks were warm. They weren't. 2 grown strangers under a low roof, polite as church, each keeping to their own side of a marriage neither one believed was real. Wyatt slept in the bunk room with the hands those first weeks, and gave Della and the boys the house, which I thought was decent of him and never said so. They spoke at meals about the work and the weather and little else. He'd say, "We'll lose stock if this holds," and she'd say, "Then we'd best bring the weak ones close," and that was the shape of their conversing. But I watched her those first weeks, and I want to tell you what I watched, because it's the part the bargain didn't account for. I watched her find the boy Tom. Continuing. That child had not let a grown soul near him in 3 years, not Wyatt, not me, not the schoolteacher in the Bend who'd given him up as simple, which he surely wasn't. He just had a wall of his own, built young the way Wyatt's was built old, and he decided the safest thing a body could do was want nothing and need nobody. Della didn't try to climb that wall. I'll give her that, she was too wise to try. She just set down, every day, a little something on her side of it and walked away. The first morning, she made flapjacks and put one on the boy's plate and never looked to see if he ate it. The second morning she put 2, and a dab of the molasses she'd brought in her own carpet bag, the last of it, and again never looked. By the end of the week the boy was at the table before the rest of us, waiting, though he'd have died before he'd say so. She taught him without seeming to teach him, gave him small jobs and made them sound like favors to her. "Tom, I can't reach the high shelf, would you climb up and hand me down the flour?" When the boy was 7 and could no more reach that shelf than fly, but he'd drag the stool over and climb up proud as a rooster and hand it down, and she'd say, "Well, I don't know what I'd do without you," and the boy would go red to the ears and not be able to hide that he was pleased. Wyatt watched it too. I caught him at it more than once, stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand, watching this stranger woman do in a week what he hadn't managed in 3 years, and I couldn't read what was on his face. It wasn't jealousy. I think it was closer to grief, the grief of a man seeing, plain in front of him, the exact thing his house had been missing, and knowing he was the one who hadn't been able to supply it. The snow came in earnest the second week and shut the passes, and that was when the work turned hard and the bargain started, without anybody meaning it to turn into something else. It started with the calves. We'd a late bunch of calves that fall, dropped too near winter, and when the first true blizzard came howling down out of the Sabines, we lost track of a dozen head of cows and their late calves that had drifted up a draw chasing the last of the grass. By the time the snow let up enough to see, they'd been 2 days in it. Wyatt and I and the 2 younger hands rode out at first light to find them, and it was brutal going, the horses breasting drifts to their chests, the cold alive thing that got into your bones and stayed. We found the cows. We found most of the calves dead, frozen in the night, and that's a hard thing to come on, a little dead thing in the snow, no matter how many winters you've seen. But there were 3 calves still alive, barely, too far gone to walk and too far gone near to live, and Wyatt did what you do, which is throw them across the saddles and run them back to the barn and try. We got them in out of the wind, and Wyatt looked at them, and his face said he didn't think much of their chances, and he was turning to go back out for the rest of the stock, when Della came across from the house with her sleeves already rolled. "Leave them with me," she said. Wyatt looked at her. "They'll likely die. It's no use freezing yourself over." "Then they'll die warm and not alone," she said. "And if they don't, that's 3 head you keep. Go see to the rest. I've got these." And she had them. She had the boys hauling hot stones from the kitchen fire wrapped in sacking to pack around those calves, and she had old blankets, and she rubbed life back into them with handfuls of straw for the better part of a day, working over them on her knees in the cold barn until her hands were raw, and she got 2 of the 3 up on their legs by nightfall. 2 head out of 3 that any other hand would have left in the snow. Wyatt came in from the high draw near dark, half froze himself, and stood in the barn door and looked at those 2 calves standing wobbly at a pail Della was holding. And he didn't say thank you, because he didn't have the words, but I saw him take his own coat off and put it around her shoulders where she knelt, because she'd been out there in just her shawl for hours and hadn't noticed the cold for tending the stock. She looked up at him, surprised with his big coat swallowing her. "You'll catch your death," he said, gruff, and turned and walked out before she could answer. That was the first warm thing that passed between them. A coat in a cold barn. It doesn't sound like much, but I'd worked for that man 11 years, and I knew what it cost him to do even that, to let himself notice that a body was cold and to care that she was, and I went to my bunk that night thinking the wall might have a door in it after all. The sickness came in the deep of January, when the valley had been shut a month, and the snow stood to the eaves on the north side of the barn. It was the boy Eli took it first. He'd been riding the 3 miles to the school in the Bend whenever the weather broke enough to let him, and I think he carried the fever home from some other child there, but it took hold of him hard the way a thing will take hold of a boy who's been hungry too long in his life and hasn't the meat on him to fight it. He came in one evening flushed and shivering both at once, and by midnight he was out of his head with the heat of it, talking to people who weren't in the room, calling for his pa who was 3 years dead. Della didn't sleep for 2 nights. She sat by that boy with a basin of snow melt and a rag and brought his fever down by hand, an inch at a time, the way she'd brought the calves back. And Wyatt, I'll tell you what Wyatt did. The nearest doctor was in Harker's Bend, 10 miles off through passes no horse could cross, and any other man would have said so and let it lie. Wyatt put on every wool thing he owned and took the big gray that was the strongest animal we had, and he went out into that closed country in the black middle of the night to fetch the doctor down. I tried to stop him. I stood at the barn door with the lantern and I said, "Wyatt, you'll not make the bend, no man could, you'll die in a drift and we'll lose you and the boy both." And he looked at me, and I want you to understand, this was a man who'd shown me nothing but flat gray weather across his face for 11 years. He looked at me and there was something lit behind his eyes, something almost like fear, which I'd never seen in him, not even the spring Sarah died. "That boy is hers," he said, "and she is mine. I'll not lose another one under my roof for want of trying, Amos. Get out of the door." "She is mine." He didn't even hear himself say it, but I heard it. He didn't make the bend, no man could have, but he made the Dahlin place at the foot of the pass, 8 miles of murderous going, and the Dahlin boy rode the last leg out the far side where the snow lay thinner, and between the two of them they got the doctor turned and brought him round the long low road and into Cedar Hollow by the second nightfall. By then Della had already done the hard work of it with her own 2 hands, and the boy's fever had broken near dawn. But Wyatt didn't know that out on the pass, and he'd ridden into the teeth of a thing that kills men every winter on the chance of saving a boy who wasn't his by blood and hadn't been under his roof but 6 weeks. He came home frostbit on 2 fingers and gray with exhaustion, and Della met him at the door. She'd been up 2 nights and her brother was through the worst, and she looked at this man swaying in the doorway with ice in his beard who'd near killed himself for her brother's sake, and something went over her face that the bargain had never put there. "You fool," she said very low. "You stubborn, good fool." And she took his frozen hands in both of hers and held them to her own throat to warm them, which is the warmest place a body has, and Wyatt Crane stood there and let her, and I saw the wall come down. Not all at once, but I saw the first stones of it go. He moved into the house that week. Not loud, nobody announced it, but the bunk in the bunkhouse went cold and the lamp in the front room burned later, and the 2 of them would sit up after the boys were abed, not always talking, her with her mending and him with a bridle he was forever pretending needed fixing, just sitting in the same warm room because they'd got to where the same warm room was where they wanted to be. Continuing. It was Della found out about the debt. Wyatt had carried a note on Cedar Hollow for 6 years, since the bad winter that killed half his herd, and he'd never breathed a word of it to a living soul, least of all to her. He paid it down a little each season and ground his teeth and told nobody, because to Wyatt Crane a debt was a private shame, a thing a man bore alone the way he bore everything alone. But Della kept the house, and keeping a house means keeping its accounts, and one evening she came on the banker's letters in the bottom of the desk, and she read them and she understood, the way a woman who's been poor understands instantly, exactly how close to the edge the ranch was riding. She didn't scold him for hiding it. She did something better. The next morning she laid the letters out on the table between them and she said, "We're partners in this house or we're nothing, Wyatt Crane. You'll not carry this alone another day. Show me the books, all of them." And he did. That was the thing, he did. He sat down with this woman he'd married for a bargain, and he opened the whole hard truth of his accounts to her, every dollar owed, and they bent over the figures together by lamplight half the night, and between the 2 of them they found the way through it. It was her idea, the timber. There was good standing timber up the north draw that Wyatt had never cut because cutting it was more work than 2 men could do. But Della had been raised in lumber country, and she knew its worth. And she figured that if they took a crew up come the first thaw and ran the logs down the Quillen on the high water, they'd clear enough in one season to take the banker's hand off the ranch's throat for good. "It's my brother's strong back and my own and your hands and your men," she said, "and it'll be the 4 boys' inheritance saved, not just yours. I've a stake in this ground now same as you. Let me earn it." I want to set down plain what passed in Wyatt's face when she said that, because I think it was the moment the bargain died and the marriage was born. He'd married her to keep his house and mind his boy through one winter. He'd thought of her, I believe, as a thing he was doing a kindness to, a widow he'd given a roof. And here she sat showing him she was the equal partner in the saving of everything he had, the one with the knowledge he lacked, offering not to be carried but to carry her share of the load. Nobody had stood beside Wyatt Crane as an equal since Sarah died. He'd forgotten it could be done. "All right," he said, rough, "we'll cut the timber together." The winter that had started so cold turned, somewhere in there, into the best season that ranch had known in years, though the snow lay just as deep. The house was full. Where there'd been one silent man and one silent boy, there was now a table of 5 that argued and laughed and read aloud of an evening out of the schoolmaster's books that Eli guarded so close. The 2 boys had become brothers in everything but blood, thick as thieves, Tom following the older Eli around like a pup, and Eli, who'd had nobody to be the big one for, his whole short, hard life, growing tall and the being looked up to. I'd watch them haul wood together and squabble together, and I'd think of the 2 cold boys in the wagon bed that first night, and I'd marvel. And Della and Wyatt. They came to it slow, the way 2 people come to a thing when they've both been burned and both learned to go careful. But it came. I'd see them out by the corral in the blue evening, just standing, her shoulder near his, watching the light go off the sabines, not needing to talk. I'd see him bring her things, the first crocus that came up by the south wall when the snow drew back, laid on the table by her plate without a word, and her face when she found it. I'd see her stand between him and the worst of his own black moods, the days the grief still rode him, and bring him back gentle without ever once asking him to be other than the hard, quiet man he was. It was her, in the end, he took up the rise to the grave. I don't know what moved him to it. A warm afternoon in the breaking of winter, the snow gone soft and patchy on the south slopes, and he asked her to walk up the rise with him, and I happened to be mending the pasture fence within sight of the place, so I saw though I didn't hear. He took her up to the flat stone where Sarah and the baby lay, the stone he'd never taken a soul to, that he visited alone and told no one. And he stood there with his hat in his hands, and he talked. A long while he talked, and Della stood beside him and listened, and once she put her hand on his arm and left it there. He was telling her, I knew, telling her the name he'd never said, letting the woman he'd buried be a person spoken of in the warm air instead of a wound he carried in the cold dark alone. When they came down off the rise his face was wet, and he didn't trouble to hide it, and hers was too, and they came down with her hand in his. And that was the first time I ever saw Wyatt Crane hold a body's hand in the open daylight where God and his foreman could see. That evening he said to her at the table in front of the boys and me and the 2 hands, plain as he'd say anything, "I married you for a bargain, Della. I'll not insult you by pretending otherwise." The room went still. The boys looked up. But I'd be a liar if I let it stand as a bargain, because it stopped being one a long while back, and I've not had the courage to say so till now. He turned the thin band on her finger with his thumb. "I don't want a housekeeper to see me through a winter. I want my wife, and I want her for every winter I've got left, and the springs and summers too. If you'll have me as I am, and I know what I am, I'm a hard man and a slow one, and I come to this late, I'd ask you to stay. Not for the roof, for me." And Della Hartley, who'd come off a cold stage with 1 carpetbag and a brother and a crate of dead man's books, and who had asked that man for nothing but to not be spoken down to, looked back at him with the whole table holding its breath, and she said, "I had that figured out by the 2nd week, Wyatt. I've only been waiting on you to catch up." The boys whooped. The hands grinned into their plates. I had to go out to the porch a minute, and I'll tell you it was the cold made my eyes run and nothing else, and any man who says different can come say it to me. Continuing. The thaw came on full in April, and we cut the timber. It was the hardest month's work I ever put my hand to. The whole crew of us up the north draw felling and trimming and snaking the logs down to the quillin, and Della was in it to her elbows same as the men, cooking for a crew of a dozen and keeping the tally, and once, when the log boom jammed at the bend below the falls, and a younger hand named Prout got himself pinned in the cold water against the snag. It was Della who kept her head and got the rope to him and hauled with the rest of us and got the boy out with nothing worse than a broke arm and a long shiver. She'd have made a hand, that woman. She made a better partner than most hands I've known. We ran the logs down on the high water and sold them downriver at the mill in Quillen Forks for better money than even Della had reckoned. And Wyatt rode into Harker's Bend in May and laid the whole of the banker's note on the desk in front of him and paid Cedar Hollow free and clear for the first time in 6 years. He came home with the paper that said the ground was theirs, all theirs, owing no man, and he didn't give it to me to put in the strongbox the way he'd have done the year before. He gave it to Della. "Half of this is yours," he said. "More than half, put it where you think best." She put it in the desk with the schoolmaster's books, her brother's books, the two families' goods in the one drawer, which I always thought said the whole thing without a word needing said. They were married again that June, properly, was how Della put it, though they'd been married legal since the snow. The whole valley came, what there was of it, and Reverend Tolliver rode out from the Bend. And this time there were flowers because the south meadow was thick with them, and the two boys stood up beside the pair of them in clean shirts, and Della wore a dress the color of the bluebells and Wyatt wore that same black wool coat he'd been married in twice now, but he wore it different. He wore it like a man walking towards something instead of away from a grave. I gave the bride away, since there was no one else to do it, and I was prouder of that than near anything in my life. They had children of their own in the years that followed, 3 that lived, and they raised them up at Cedar Hollow alongside Tom and Eli, and you'd never have known, watching that brood tumble around the place, which were born to the marriage and which were brought to it. They were all just cranes. Eli grew up and took his schoolmaster father's calling and taught the valley's children 3 days a week in the Bend, and worked the ranch the other 4. And Tom, quiet little Tom who'd let nobody near, grew into the easiest, openest young man you'd ever want to meet, because a woman had set a flapjack on his plate every morning of one long winter and taught him it was safe to be loved. Wyatt lived to be an old man. I worked for him near to the end and longer than I should have, because I couldn't bear to leave the place. And in all those years I watched a thing I want to leave set down before I'm gone myself, which is the reason I've told you the whole of it. I watched a man who'd walled himself up in his grief and decided he'd buried his heart with his first wife find out he'd only buried part of it, and that the rest was waiting on a cold stage platform with a carpetbag in her hand and terms on her lips, asking only to be treated as a person and not a charity. He married her to get through a winter. He stayed married to her for 40 years because somewhere in the snowbound dark of that first hard season, the two of them quit being a bargain and turned into the truest thing either of them ever had. The last winter of his life, near the end, I sat up with him some nights, and one of those nights he was looking at Della asleep in her chair by the fire, gray-headed now, the both of them, and he said to me, quiet, so as not to wake her, "Amos, I'll tell you the foolishest thing I ever believed." "What's that, Wyatt?" "That I'd had my whole life already and the rest was just waiting it out." He watched her a while. "I had it backwards. The waiting out was the first part. The life started the night she got off that stage." He shook his old head. "And I near let it freeze to death in a barn because I was too proud to put my own coat round it sooner. He died that spring, easy in his sleep, with her hand in his. He'd asked to be laid up on the rise, but not under Sarah's stone, beside it with his own, and room left by him for Della when her time came, which was some years on. He'd made his peace with all of it. The first love he'd grieved so long he'd near grieved himself into the grave alongside her, and the second that had thawed him back into a living man, one calf and one flapjack and one frozen ride at a time. I'm an old man telling you an old man's story, and I've kept it short of nothing because some things ought to be told whole. A hard man and a hard-pressed woman struck a cold bargain to outlast a winter. And out of the grit of it, out of the small daily kindnesses that cost more than they looked to, a coat in a barn, a stone wrapped warm for a calf, the books of 2 dead fathers in the one drawer, A name finally spoken aloud on a rise in the breaking light. They built between them the warmest home that valley ever held. That's the whole of it. That's how Wyatt Crane married a stranger to get through one winter, and couldn't imagine a single spring without her by the time the snow drew back. I'll go back and fill in what I passed over quick, because the floor of a thing is the part you don't see, and there was a deal more to that winter than a coat and a fever. Take the bargain itself. I made it sound like it was struck clean in the snow outside the depot, and the words of it were, but a bargain between two people who have each been broke by life doesn't go down clean. It goes down wary, with both parties watching for the trick. The first month at Cedar Hollow, Della Hartley moved through that house like a woman who'd learned the hard way that a roof can be taken back. She worked twice what the bargain asked, and I came to understand why. She was paying ahead, building credit against the day Wyatt might decide he'd made a poor trade and put her and Eli back on the stage. She didn't trust the ground under her feet because the ground had never once held. I saw it plainest with the food. That woman could not abide waste, and more than that, she could not abide an empty larder. She'd come from real hunger. I learned later that the husband she'd buried, a man named Tom Hartley, had been a sometime miner and a steady drinker who'd left her and the boy with nothing but debts when a shaft fell on him, and that she and Eli had wintered one whole year on what she could earn taking in wash and what the boy could snare. So at Cedar Hollow she put up stores like the snow might never melt. She had the smokehouse full, and the root cellar packed, and strings of dried apple hung from every rafter in the kitchen, and Wyatt watched her do it and never said a word against the labor of it, though I think he marveled. One night I heard him say to her, gentle for him, "Della, the ranch has never gone hungry. You needn't work yourself gray over the larder." And she stopped what she was doing and looked at him, and she said, "I know what an empty cellar looks like in February, Wyatt. I'll thank you to let me keep ours full." And he never raised it again. That was an early thing between them, him learning that her hard ways had hard reasons and letting her keep them. Take Tom, too. I told you she found him with flapjacks, and she did, but the finding was slower and finer than that. There was a night early on before the fever when a windstorm came through and rattled the whole house, and that boy, who'd not let a grown soul comfort him in 3 years, came creeping out of his room white-faced and looking for I don't know what, some warmth, some hand, and he stopped dead in the front room when he saw it wasn't empty. Della was up, banking the fire. She didn't make a fuss of him. She didn't say poor lamb or come here or any of the things that would have sent that wary child bolting back to his room. She just said, easy, like it was the most natural thing in the world, "Good, you're up. I can't recall, do we bank this fire from the left or the right? Your pa's particular and I never can remember." And the boy, who knew exactly how his uncle banked a fire, came over solemn and showed her, and she thanked him grave as if he'd done her a true service, and then she said, "Long as you're up, sit with me a spell, I don't like a storm alone," which was a kindness dressed as a need, and the boy sat. They sat by that fire through the whole blow, the woman and the wary child, neither making much of it, and in the morning the thing was different between them and stayed different. She'd let him be the one who helped. She'd let him keep his pride and take the comfort both. I never knew anybody handle a hurt child so wise. Continuing. And there was the matter of the wolves, which I left clean out, and shouldn't have, because it was the night the two boys became brothers for good. It was deep January, near the same stretch as the fever, a hard-froze moonlit night, and the wolves came down out of the Sabines hungry the way they get when the deep snow buries the deer. We'd a bunch of weak stock penned close to the barn, the late calves Della had saved among them, and the wolves smelled them and came in bold. I woke to the stock screaming and the dogs gone wild, and we all of us turned out into the cold with rifles and lanterns, Wyatt and me and the two hands, and it was a near thing, a big pack, gaunt and desperate is dangerous in a wolf. What I remember is the boys. They weren't to be out there, of course. Della had them behind the barn door and meant to keep them. But the wolves split, the way a clever pack will, and 3 of them came round the back to where the weakest calves were penned separate, and it was the two boys, Tom and Eli, who saw it first through the barn slats. There wasn't time to call us. Eli, 12 years old, a schoolmaster's son who'd likely never fired a gun, took down the old scattergun Wyatt kept by the barn door, and little Tom hauled the pen gate, and the two of them drove those weak calves back into the barn's safety, while Eli stood in the gap and fired into the dark over the wolves' heads. Not to kill, the boy told us after, just to turn them because he was afraid of hitting a calf. And it turned them. The noise and the lantern Tom swung and the two boys standing their ground turned 3 hungry wolves off a sure meal. And by the time we came round the barn at a dead run it was done. The calves in. The boys white and shaking and grinning at each other like they'd whipped the whole world. Wyatt got there and took it in the open gate, the saved stock, the smoking scattergun in the 12-year-old's hands, and any man might have roared at boys for going out into a wolf night. He didn't. He looked at the two of them a long moment in the lantern light. Then he put one hand on Eli's shoulder and one on Tom's, which I'd never seen him do, touch a child by choice, and he said, "That was foolish, and it was brave. You'll not do it again." A pause. "But you did it right." And those two boys near burst with it. From that night they were inseparable, and from that night, too, I think Wyatt quit thinking of Eli as the widow's brother he'd taken on as part of a bargain and started thinking of him as his own. You don't watch a boy stand a wolf off your stock and go on counting him a stranger. Della had come to the barn door in time to see the end of it, and she didn't scold either. She gathered the two of them in, one under each arm, and over their heads she looked at Wyatt, and the look that passed between the two grown people then was the look of two parents who'd near had their hearts stopped and were each glad the other had been there for it. That's a married look. They weren't married yet, not truly, not in the heart, but they wore the look that night. Continuing. I should tell the harder middle of it too, because it wasn't all thaw and warming. There was a black stretch in February when the grief rode Wyatt worst. It came on him sometimes, the old dark. And that February it came hard, some turn of the season, some slant of light that put him in mind of the spring Sarah died. I never knew exactly what tripped it. He went silent and cold for the better part of a week, shut up in himself, short with the hands, sleeping back out in the bunk room some nights without a word of why. And here's the thing I watched, and the thing that told me what Della Hartley was made of. A lesser woman would have taken it personal. Would have thought she'd done some wrong or pushed at him to know what ailed him or gone cold back at him to match. Della did none of it. She'd seen grief before. She knew it for what it was, a weather, not a verdict, and she let it blow through without taking shelter from it and without trying to stop it. She kept the house warm and the meals coming and the boys easy, and she let Wyatt be as cold as he needed to be, and she didn't chase him and she didn't punish him, and she waited. And one night near the end of that black week, he came in late from the cold and she was up, and she didn't ask him a single question. She just set a plate in front of him and a cup of coffee laced with a little of the brandy she kept for medicine, and she sat down across from him with her mending company without demand, and after a long while in the warm quiet he started on his own to talk. Not about Sarah, not that night. Just about the work, the stock, small things. But he talked and she listened, and the dark went back down in him a degree at a time, and by the time the candle guttered he'd thought enough to say low, "I'm not easy to live with this time of year." And she said, "No, but you're worth the living with the rest of it. We'll get through your February same as we got through the snow." She'd said we. He sat with that a while. Then he got up and banked the fire and went, for the first time in a week, back into the house to sleep and not the bunk room. That was her undoing of his worst, and she did it by not flinching at it. I've thought since that it was the bravest thing in the whole story, braver than the wolves or the ride for the doctor, to stand steady and unfrightened in front of a hard man's grief and wait it out with him. There was the Dahlin family, too, that I owe a word, because they were part of the saving. Old Dahlin held the place at the foot of the pass, the one Wyatt reached the night of his ride, and the Dahlins and the Cranes had been distant, and a little cool for years over some old line dispute about water that nobody living rightly remembered the start of. But the night Wyatt came pounding on their door half froze, begging the Dahlin boy to ride the far leg for the doctor. Old Dahlin didn't hesitate over any old grudge. He sent his son out into the same killing cold without a second's pause, because that's the frontier code under all the squabbles, that you turn out for a sick child whoever's child it is. And the doing of it healed the old breach clean. Come the spring, when we ran the timber, it was Dahlin men who made up half our crew, and the money the cut brought in put both ranches right, for the Dahlins took a share for the labor and were glad of it. Della made a point of it. She had the Dahlins to supper that first thaw, the whole brood, and she sat old Dahlin at the head of the table next to Wyatt, and let the two hard old men find their way back to neighborly over her good cooking. And by the end of the night they were arguing about grass and water like men who meant to be friends about it. She knew, that woman, that a ranch doesn't survive alone in a hard country. She knit Cedar Hollow back into its valley the same way she knit its household together, by the patient daily work of it, a supper here, a kindness there, the books in the one drawer. Continuing. And the timber drive itself was a longer and harder thing than I let on, and the near loss at the boom deserves its full telling, because it was the day Wyatt knew past any doubt what he had in her. We were 3 weeks at the cut, up the north draw, felling and trimming in the mud of the breakup with the quillin running high and brown below us, and the plan was to run the whole season's timber down on one big drive while the water was up. It's dangerous work, a log drive. The most dangerous there is tons of timber moving fast on high water, and a man who slips among it doesn't often come up. We'd near 1,000 logs in the drive, and it was going well, the boom holding them in the slack water above the falls, while we fed them through the chute, a manageable few at a time. Then the boom jammed. A great key log turned crosswise in the chute, and the whole mass behind it backed and bound and started to pile, and the pressure of 1,000 logs and the high river behind them built against that jam by the second, and we all of us knew that when it let go it would let go all at once in a killing rush. The young hand Prout was out on the logs trying to free the key with a peavey when the jam shifted under him, and pinned his leg between 2 logs against the snag, in the cold fast water, with the whole bound mass groaning to break loose above him. There wasn't a man of us didn't freeze a half-second at the sight of it, because to go out on a jam that's about to break is to likely die with the man you're saving. And in that half-second it was Della, who'd no business near a log drive at all, who'd come down with the crew's dinner, who moved. She saw the geometry of it faster than any of us, saw that the snag Prout was pinned against was solid, and that a rope from the right angle on the bank could take his weight and pull him free downward, under the logs, before the jam broke over him. She was already paying out the rope and calling the line of it to Wyatt before the rest of us had our wits back. Wyatt went out on the jam on her word, trusting her read of it with his own life, and got the rope round Prout under his arms, and on Della's count the 4 of us on the bank hauled and Wyatt shoved, and the boy came free and down, and under just as the key log turned for good, and the whole 1,000 log mass let go in a roar that shook the ground, and would have ground Prout to nothing where he'd stood a breath before. Wyatt came off the breaking jam himself by a hair, leaping log to the bank as the drive thundered past, and he came up the mud soaked and shaking, and he didn't go to Prout first. He went to Della. He took her by both shoulders and looked at her like he was seeing her whole, and he said, hoarse over the roar of the river, "How did you see it?" "None of us saw it." And she said, simple, "I was raised on a drive. I've seen the boom break before." And he kept hold of her shoulders, and he said, and I heard it plain, "I'd have lost him. We'd all of us have lost him and stood here knowing it. You saved that boy's life, Della, and likely mine." And right there in front of the whole muddy crew he pulled her in and held her, just held her, the high river running by full of the timber that was going to set them free of the bank's note, and nobody whooped or grinned this time. We all just looked away and let the 2 of them have it, because we'd all near watched a man die and hadn't, on account of her. That was the day the bargain was past, all undoing. A man doesn't hold a woman like that over a saved life and go back to calling it a winter's arrangement. Continuing. So when I told you Wyatt took her up the rise to Sarah's grave, you'll understand it now for what it was, not a sudden softness, but the sum of all of it. The larder she filled against a hunger he'd never known. The wary child she gentled with a banked fire. The wolves the boys turned and the right she let them keep in the turning. The black February she stood steady through and waited out beside him. The neighbors she knit back. The boy she saved off the breaking boom and the husband she saved with him. By the time the snow drew back off the south slopes, that man had been shown a dozen plain, hard ways, exactly what manner of woman had got off the Tuesday stage with a carpetbag and a crate of dead men's books, and he took her up the rise, because a thing that true has to be told to the dead before it can be wholly given to the living. I was at the fence and saw it, as I said, but I'll add the one thing I left out. When they came down off the rise before they reached the house, Della stopped him at the pasture gate and I saw her speak to him a good while, earnest, her hand on his arm, and I learned later, she told me herself, years on, what she'd said. She'd said, "I'll not take her place, Wyatt, and I'd think less of you if you asked me to. Sarah was your first life. Let me be your second." There's room in a man for both, same as there's room in that ground up there for the stone you'll lay by her someday. I'll honor her all my days for the man she helped make you. Only let me love the man she left behind. And Wyatt Crane, who'd walled himself up for the better part of 7 years sooner than risk those words, heard a woman offer to share his heart with his own dead rather than scrub her out of it. And that, Della told me, was the moment he quit being afraid. Not before. There, at the pasture gate, with the second woman of his life telling him she'd make room for the first. He married her properly that June, as I said, in the Bluebell Meadow, and gave the bride away myself. And I've told you the long after of it. The children, the boys grown fine, the 40 years, the easy death with her hand in his, the 2 stones side by side up on the rise with room left between for her. I'm near the end of my own telling now, and my own row of fence, you might say. But I set it all down whole because I've watched men hear the short version and miss the heart of it. They hear, he married a stranger to get through a winter and came to love her, and they nod like it's a small, warm thing, a happy turn. It wasn't small. It was the hardest, finest work I ever watched 2 people do, 2 souls that life had taught to expect nothing, learning, 1 frozen calf and 1 banked fire and 1 broken log boom at a time, to expect each other, to trust the ground would hold. Wyatt Crane buried 1 love and spent 7 years believing his life was behind him, and a hard-pressed widow got off a stage with nothing but her terms and her pride and her brother's hand in hers, and out of 2 people with every reason left to stay shut, they built the warmest home that valley ever knew. From a bargain, from grit and small daily kindness and the courage, hardest of all, to be loved late. That's the whole of it now, told full. How Wyatt Crane married a stranger to outlast 1 winter, and could not, by the time the bluebells came, imagine a single spring of the rest of his life without her in it.